We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I'm still your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by Liberty Nation's national correspondent, John Klar. Now, earlier in the show, we were talking about the myths surrounding electric vehicle productions. Now, John, I want to delve a little more deeply into the infrastructure that's required to achieve the all sales of electric vehicles by 2030, or the increase in sales of electric vehicles by 2030 that's being touted by the current government. And we discussed it very, very briefly, but it seems that the infrastructure that would be needed to accommodate for that is not on a pace to keep up with it. In fact, it would fall far behind at current building operations, wouldn't it?
Well, again, there are logistics involved in manufacturing anything. And one of the key input points here is lithium. And so when you ask this question, we have competing demands worldwide for those resources. And here in this country, between various utopian plans to implement an EV universe. So California is mandating an electric truck fleet, which alone would consume pretty much all of the lithium currently created or produced in the world for like the next 30 years. So, but that's supposed to be implemented, I think, by 2035 or 40. I wrote a piece about it for Liberty Nation so people can go there to see. Now, Tim Walz has said that I think Minnesota is supposed to be entirely EV cars by 2030, as you mentioned. It's impossible. And so when you pass laws to mandate things that are impossible, I think you're going to run into a problem. And actually, you start to undermine public trust in lawmaking and the costs that are involved and the reliability issues. So what you've asked is, where are the different points of failure? Studies are showing that the EV charging stations are still not fully reliable. They certainly don't work well in the cold. The cold snap last year, most EV cars are out in California. And the cold snap found people in America stranded on the side of the road. Their cars wouldn't charge at all. The charging stations didn't work. Here in Vermont, we had people come up with the Eclipse, and they found there were nowhere near enough charging stations. They drove up here in droves, I think 200,000 people for the day. Many ended up having to stay the night when they were backed up in long queues to charge their cars. Now the question is, will this ever be feasible? And as we've discussed, the grid capacity required is monumental. The grid is already weak. And the question is whether it can sustain it. And of course, that grid then needs to be charged with what? Fossil fuels or maybe, nuclear. So when you start adding up all these costs and all these problems, and we're not talking about the environmental costs now, which we've already concluded without any question are really, well, how about worth a more thorough analysis and look before we, hit the pedal on production. But when you similarly look at the problems with the feasibility, the trucks, if we, just for an example, if we convert our tractor trailer truck system to electric batteries, so much of the tow load is going to be subsumed by the battery itself. It's going to weigh like 2,000 pounds. We haven't even got into the problems of producing it, where that amount of lithium is going to come from and where it's going to go. But literally, the trucking industry is in crisis. They already operate on small margins. The charging stations are going to cost billions of dollars. It is absolutely impossible, but it's making a lot of people a real lot of money in the short term before we figure out at step 2 thinking that it doesn't work.
Yeah, that does seem to be the main issue, that you have this utopian ideal that everything will be electric without questioning where the electricity is coming from. And as you point out, it's either going to come from A, fossil fuels, or B, nuclear. And I'm not in any way an expert on these things, but it does seem to me that despite the recent, I say recent, several years ago, was it Fukushima power plant issue, which was like a 30 or 40-year-old plant, the modern nuclear power plants are actually reasonably environmental, aren't they? Good for the environment. Well, not good for the environment, but they're not actually a major net drag on the environment, or have I got that wrong?
No, they are. So this is a very interesting page turner in our pursuit of technological salvation. As you said, it's utopian. Often this sort of, I find this is very interesting, this idea, and I'm not dodging your question, but there's an idea that Well, if science hasn't solved the problem, well, they'll figure it out later. This is something of faith. I run into this a lot as a farmer when I tell people that you can't replace cows with synthetic fertilizers, and they say, "Oh, but we'll figure it out." Are you really going to manufacture microbes and poop in a factory? Now, you were mentioning that you don't know about a lot of this stuff, but that's because you assign it to me, and I have to thank you at
Absolutely
Liberty
right.
Nation. I do these deep dives and I go, wow, I didn't even know this about rubber tires, or though I haven't done that piece yet, but I have proposed a piece about these 6 new internationally recognized models for smaller nuclear reactors. There are also major groundbreaking innovations being made almost daily in fusion reactors. We may soon have solar panels that are twice as efficient as the ones we have now. Maybe we should wait a few years and build a billion of those and using coal and all kinds of chemicals. There's an issue here of jumping off the starting line before we even have the technology we have faith in. And so interestingly about nuclear is that the whole world is rethinking nuclear power. And part of that is because of the pollution involved in solar panels and EV cars. Suddenly, those things that were presented as the clean energy alternatives, we're seeing, if we're going to look at the real science, are actually much more polluting than that old, hated nuclear energy. And so many of us are starting to look at, even without the new technologies, storing spent fuel rods is less dangerous than spewing rubber into the oceans and wiping out salmon fisheries, which is what we're doing. So now we only have one real hurdle left for nuclear, and that would be safety. And you're correct. There have been 6 new models, I believe, and they are all much safer, if nothing else. They're probably more efficient. The technology is amazing. So, let's not have faith in technology that doesn't exist yet. And let's look at the technologies we have critically to figure out which one is the least destructive. It's kind of like a political election.
Hmm.
And I think we end up with nuclear again. The nuclear option is
The nuclear
best.
option. Yeah, let's hope that doesn't make it to the filibuster in the next Senate. But okay, so let's talk about the solar panels. And you say that obviously people are trying to make solar panels more efficient, but and it just seems to me that as they are currently constituent, there's very little possibility that you can gain like double the value within the size that you're getting because of how solar energy and storage actually works. And you'd be tipping the balance between efficiency and collection by trying to almost double the efficiency of uh, a single solar panel, which means inevitably, if I've got that right, which means inevitably that the answer to increasing the output from solar panels is to have more solar panels. Now, the question is, where does that go? Now, and I wonder if what we're seeing is we're actually losing good land that is capable of feeding cows or just being there to regenerate things in favor of these solar panels. Well, maybe we should be looking at where's a mountain that nobody climbs up and putting things on there. Is it more difficult? Yes. Is it better for the environment long term? Probably. Last 30 seconds or so, John, what's your take on that?
Oh, 30 seconds. Well, actually, there's a big movement to site some of these solar panel sites deep in deserts where they can use them solely for the data processing. They need massive amounts of
Hmm.
electricity for. That actually is something being considered. You've thrown a lot of stuff there, but solar panels, once again, they're not all the same, but they do use coal. They do produce a lot of pollution that's non-carbon. And it's Elon Musk who said they've become more efficient. And in a piece I did for Liberty Nation, I used his proposals. We would basically have to put like 11 smallest states in America completely covered in solar panels to supply the energy needs. It's destructive. By the way, they all end up in landfills, not like my solar panels. They're called blades of grass. They grow out of the ground every year. They don't need a Chinese factory or coal, and they go back in the ground. We're replacing all these natural processes. So it won't. How can we ever have enough solar panels unless we have major advances in technology? And even then, as you say, maybe it's not the solution. Maybe we need to manufacture and consume less. Nobody wants to hear that, but maybe that's something we should look at as conservationists or conservatives.
John Klar, thanks ever so much for joining us. And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to mention that Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement. I'd also like to thank our guests for today, Sarah Cowgill and John Klar, and most importantly, take a moment to thank you, the listeners out there in Radioland, for tuning in each and every week. You are appreciated.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.